The sun hung low over the Montana Valley, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. When Jacob first saw her, he'd been riding fence line on the northern edge of his ranch, the same land his grandfather had worked until his hands grew too tired to hold the reins. From the ridge he spotted movement near the creek. A woman, alone, dragging logs twice her size toward a clearing where the foundation of a cabin stood half-finished. Jacob was 43 years old, and the years since Sarah's death had carved deep lines around his eyes. The cancer had taken her slowly, painfully, leaving him with a silence so heavy it pressed against his chest at night. Their dream of children had died with her, and now the ranch house echoed with memories of laughter that would never return. He'd learned to live with loneliness the way other men lived with old injuries, accepting it as part of who he'd become. He watched the woman for 3 days before approaching, curious about her determination. She worked from dawn until the light failed, measuring, cutting, fitting each log with careful precision. There was something sacred in her solitude, something he recognized because he carried it too. On the 4th day he rode down to the creek with a thermos of coffee and his best excuse neighborly concern. She straightened when she heard his horse, wiping sweat from her forehead with a dirt-streaked forearm. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd thought, maybe 35, with eyes that held their own kind of weathering. "Name's Jacob Whitmore," he said, tipping his hat. "My land runs along the ridge there. Figured you might could use some coffee." She studied him for a long moment before accepting the cup. "Emma Carson, and I appreciate it, but I'm not looking for help." "Didn't offer any," he replied, though watching her struggle with a beam that would take 2 strong men to lift made his hands itch to intervene. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Jacob would ride by, always with some practical reason, checking on a calf that wandered, fixing a shared fence post, bringing news from town. Emma never asked him to stay, but she never told him to leave either. Slowly, in the spaces between hammering and sawing, their stories emerged like water from stone. She'd been married once, to a man whose charm hid cruelty. The cabin was her reclamation, built on land she'd inherited from an aunt she barely remembered. Every log she placed was a declaration of independence, proof that she could create something solid from her own 2 hands. She'd left behind a life of bruises and broken promises, and she wasn't eager to trust again. Jacob understood. He told her about Sarah, about the nursery they'd painted yellow that never held a crib, about how he'd almost sold the ranch because every corner held ghosts. They were both building something. He realized she was building shelter, and he was building the courage to believe in tomorrow. The first snow came early that year, catching Emma's cabin still lacking a roof. Jacob arrived at dawn to find her sitting on the incomplete floor, crying silent tears of frustration. Without a word, he began unloading timber from his truck. She stood, angry at first, ready to refuse his charity. But something in his quiet determination stopped her. "I'm not doing this for you," he said softly. "I'm doing this because watching you build alone reminds me I don't have to be alone either. Let me help, Emma, not because you need saving, but because maybe we both need building." They worked through autumn and into winter, their hands growing calloused together. Jacob taught her the tricks his grandfather had taught him: how to read the grain of wood, how to make joints that would hold through Montana's harshest storms. Emma showed him that strength wasn't about carrying burdens alone, but knowing when to share the weight. The cabin rose around them like an answer to prayers neither had dared to voice. On the day they set the final beam, Emma turned to Jacob with tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You gave me something to build again. You reminded me that endings aren't final unless we let them be." Spring arrived with wildflowers carpeting the valley, and Emma invited Jacob to dinner in her finished cabin. The fireplace he'd helped construct crackled with warmth, and as they sat together watching the flames, she reached for his hand. "I came here to be alone," she whispered. "To prove I didn't need anyone." "And did you prove it?" Jacob asked. "Yes," she smiled. "And then I learned something better, that choosing to need someone isn't weakness. It's the bravest kind of building there is." 2 years later, a cradle sat in the corner of Emma's cabin, carved by Jacob's careful hands. Their daughters slept peacefully while outside. They broke ground on an addition, more rooms for the family they were creating, log by log, day by day, from the ruins of their separate sorrows into something whole and unbreakable and true.